going to talk about Indigenous peoples of the Ag Reserve. It's kind of a topic that has been little explored. There's not a lot of so we're hoping to start to develop all the resources so we can learn more about the first inhabitants here. Fascinating. Let's see, I have things to say. The project, this particular, and this is the sort of the launching of what we call our community roundtable project. So these projects, they're sort of a multifaceted thing where about 10, a cohort of about 10 people get together and they are led by a guide and they go on excursions, learn some history, and then all with the intent of creating a project out of what they've learned and what they felt. It can be written, video, it can be an art, painted project, it can be sculpture, anything. And then at the
as an English teacher, I need to say it can also be writing.
and
this is open to anyone that enjoys creative expression. You don't have to be a pro, you don't have to be an established artist.
It's really just an exploration and it's sort of fun. It's meaningful because there are 10 of you exploring something new and different. And you get together at times and talk about what you're seeing, what you're learning, what you're creating out of the experience.
And those sessions where we get together and we meet, they'll be held in a hybrid format. So a lot of people are concerned about prior obligations, commuting times, and things like that. We can make it work.
And then it culminates in what we call a roundtable discussion, and everyone presents the work they did with the public in a setting much like this. People can ask questions and learn about what you've done. How was that? This is our third roundtable project. We've had two, one on African American history and one on a writers and painters journey, where writers would write and painters would paint what they felt from the writing. Each really successful. The participants were just thrilled with having done it. So I can't encourage you, any stronger to participate because it is really unusual and very fun and very hard to describe. Now the nice thing about this one is Heritage Montgomery and the Montgomery County government and Maryland Heritage Area authorities are sponsoring this. So we got grant money from them to do this. So that's helpful, and it kept the cost of the project down, and the participation is only $95, which is nothing considering you're getting hours and hours and hours of guidance by Christine plus 2 field trips, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, this is the launch of that. That's it. Hooray!
Okay, so thank you for coming, everyone. Welcome to the storyteller session. We'll be here for about the next couple hours. So I want to share, if at any point you need to get up and stretch your legs, please feel free. If at any point you need to leave, please know that the session will be recorded and will be posted online later. I also would encourage you, if you enjoyed today's session, you found it to be interesting and illuminating, please share it widely because, as Sandy said, this is a history that has really been overlooked and erased and neglected. We really want it to get on people's radars, and we want it to be more accessible and inspirational for people. Also, anyone needs to use the restroom, there is one around the corner there. You can also take this back door here, and you can use the restrooms over there at Locals. Additionally, there are 2 jars there if you would like to make a donation to either the Historic Medley District, who is graciously letting us use this beautiful space, and or Riverworks Art Center, who is the one that is running the Storytellers program and the roundtable session that's coming up. And one last thing, and then we'll get started. Right there by the main front door, you'll see a brochure rack there. Thank you, Jeff. There's a row of Sugarloaf Regional Trails organizations, Native American Heritage Trail Guide, which specifically deals with Native American sites here in this corner of the Agricultural Reserve. You can also find it online. So if you're more of a digital person, you can get it there. If you're a paper person, feel free to grab one on the way out. So, it's not working, Jeff. I'm trying the space bar and the arrow keys. Okay, yeah, it helps to turn it on. There we go, yay! Okay, so my name is Christine Ray. I think you actually didn't introduce me. I have lived here in the Louisville area for almost 20 years now. I'm a lifelong Marylander. I am an English professor at Frederick Community College currently. I'm also working on a book project with my co-author who grew up here in the Ag Reserve, Lennon Gross. We're writing a book about local spooky folklore and hidden history.
Cool.
So if you're interested in that, please come see me after the presentation. I can give you details about that as well. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Today's focus is Indigenous peoples of the Potomac Piedmont. This is meant to be sort of a foundational introduction to this history and to local sites here. It's not meant to be comprehensive. And it's really meant to be something to tickle people's curiosity and encourage them to find out more, to explore more, and to support the Indigenous peoples that are still living here in Maryland. And that's why I chose this picture for this particular slide. Today's presentation will have a special emphasis on the Piscataway, and I'll get into that later, why Piscataway specifically. But I do want to emphasize that they are not gone. They are very much a vibrant, dynamic community that's doing a lot of cool things here recently. But today we're mainly going to be focusing on the history, the predecessors of Piscataway and other groups.
I think my batteries. No,
Okay.
there it goes. It woke up.
Okay.
Space bar. And space bar.
Okay, yay! So what can you expect from today? The introduction, quick land acknowledgement, which I'll explain to you what that is if you're unfamiliar with that. And then because it is a storyteller's session and I am an English professor, I'm kind of using this extended metaphor of storytelling throughout today. So talking about how this sort of research got started for me, the authors, which would be some of the Indigenous groups that were here in the area, looking at the various sites here in the northwestern corner of the Ag Reserve, and work on expanding the story. So having a more comprehensive and accurate timeline of local history. And then if you yourself are interested by the time you leave here today, and I hope you will be, where can you get started to find out more? So I've curated some resources where you can go to find out more, inviting everyone to this roundtable project. You might want to be careful, I think she's coming in this door. And then a call to action for you, and we'll have time for questions and answers then. Sound good?
Just tell me.
Okay.
I think it's the distance.
I can just go like the old film strips. Okay, Jeff. So land acknowledgement. Anyone in here familiar with these land acknowledgements? Okay, great. So for those of you that are not familiar with land acknowledgements, maybe in the last 5-10 years, you've seen these popping up more frequently at events for various organizations and institutions. And it's basically a way to show respect to the Indigenous peoples whose unceded lands that we are living and working on and enjoying. However, I do want to say that land acknowledgements are not meant to be an end-all be-all. There needs to be some type of follow-through and follow-up beyond just creating one of these statements and reading it. So the land acknowledgement for today is that I acknowledge that we live and work upon the stolen lands of the Piscataway tribal nation. I affirm the need to share that history, the rightful past, present, and future inhabitants of the land. I acknowledge the thousands of tribal members in our community that are displaced from their own homelands and have moved to Montgomery County. The state of Maryland formally recognized the Piscataway Indian Nation and the Piscataway Conoy tribe. This does not account for all Indigenous inhabitants of the region, past and present. I acknowledge the social, physical, spiritual, and kinship relationships this land continues to share with the Indigenous nations of the Potomac River, the Monocacy River, and the Chesapeake Bay. I acknowledge that these relationships have been displaced, damaged, and dispelled. I acknowledge a place out of balance. I acknowledge our responsibility to Indigenous nations to repair unhealthy relationships and to steward all life. I'm committed to contributing to the conversation through continuous research example of a land acknowledgement statement, and this was adapted from some statements at my own institution where I teach, as well as Montgomery County's racial equity and social justice advisory committees. Thank you. So again, thank you for coming to this event. And again, this is not meant to be comprehensive. It is a work in progress. And I'll also say, and you'll understand this better in a moment, that it is based on the current information that is out there, which is limited. A lot of it is obscure. So even though it may sound a little strange to say so, I kind of hope that some of this presentation will end up being outdated because new information will be uncovered and shared. So for the moment, it is accurate. I will be posting this PowerPoint online as well as the recording, and again, I encourage everyone to share it to further disseminate this information. Jeff? Sandy. Cool. So you may be wondering, oh yes.
Go ahead. No, I was pointing to you.
It's okay.
Oh yeah. Yes.
I'm curious why you didn't ask me to stand. I was taught to stand for a minute.
Oh.
As a way of honoring the words. Otherwise, it just words in the stand.
That's a good point. I apologize. Thank you
Oh,
for telling me that.
were you unaware of that?
I was unaware of it because the work that I've been doing, if you can hear her, she was curious why I didn't ask people to stand for the land acknowledgement, and I did not know that, and I apologize. But I would say the work that I've been doing with land acknowledgements and Indigenous work at my institution has been during COVID and post-COVID when a lot of our meetings were on Zoom.
Would you mind if you
Sure.
visit that and ask
Sure.
people to stand?
We can go back. Yeah, Sandy, could you go
Yeah,
back,
yeah.
please? If everyone would please stand for the land acknowledgement if you are able.
Please stand your hand.
You can say it again. Yeah, of course. I acknowledge that we live and work upon the stolen lands
Work upon the stolen lands
of the Piscataway Conoy tribal nation. I affirm the need to share that history with the rightful past, present, and future inhabitants of the land. I acknowledge the thousands of tribal members in our community that are displaced from their own homelands and have moved to Montgomery County. The state of Maryland formally recognized the Piscataway Indian Nation and the Piscataway Conoy tribe, but this does not account for all Indigenous inhabitants of the region, past and present. I acknowledge the social, physical, spiritual, and kinship relationships this land continues to share with the Indigenous nations of the Potomac River, the Monocacy River, and the Chesapeake Bay. I acknowledge that these relationships have been displaced, damaged, and dispelled. I acknowledge a place out of balance. I acknowledge our responsibility to Indigenous nations to repair unhealthy relationships and to steward all life. I am committed to contributing to the conversation through continuous research and action. Thank you. And thank you for speaking up. I appreciate that. Okay, so you may be wondering, how did an English professor get interested in this topic? And as I said before, I've lived here in this area for about 20 years, really interested in local history. Since 2018, I've been conducting the Haunted History walking tours for our local historic medley district. And I've been working on this book project with my co-author since about 2020. And when COVID broke out, there was a lot of concern around people's mental health, excessive screen time, people being isolated, and such. And so I have an online blog. So I did a blog series called Explore the Reserve, this corner of the Agricultural Reserve, where I would pick different sites around here that probably weren't ones people would typically visit, and do a little bit of research about the history of the site and give some tips about, what you could go look at and experience at the site. And so as part of this, I said, I'm going to highlight McKee Beshers, right? And I didn't really know a lot of the history history about it, but in researching the history for this particular blog post, one of the sources that I found just mentioned very quickly offhand in passing that there were 6 Native American villages in between White's Ferry and Seneca. And that was the only time I could recall, despite all of this interest in history, ever hearing that history mentioned here. And so it really kind of opened a door to me to look around at the landscape with new eyes and say, well, where's the documentation here? Other than this quick mention, which actually was from the Native American Heritage Trail Guide there. And so I got very interested and started doing more and more research, even though it doesn't fit into this book research that I'm doing. But I sort of felt like a duty to do that, even though it's not directly anything that I can use. And so that's what I've been doing, just sort of as a hobby and a way to contribute back and to help people learn more. See? So this area was called Mangarutu, the land above the falls. So here above the Potomac River. And in doing some of my research, I read a quote from historian Helen Roundtree, who primarily focuses on the Powhatan chiefdom down in Virginia, but applies to here as well. She said, I found out early there was not much funding available for studying a history that is never supposed to have been recorded. Eastern Indian history is only buried instead, or modern people are supposed to be gone. So it really is a challenge in a lot of ways, historically speaking. Piscataway oral history says the western shore of the Potomac was a mixing bowl of different groups, and that's what I've uncovered so far as well. Today I'm focusing a lot on the Piscataway peoples because out of all the groups in this area, they have the longest standing sort of permanent ties and contributions to this area. But as you'll see in a moment, there are much more groups than just the Piscataway, historical Piscataway here. Again, the details aren't well known, and they certainly deserve way more study. In inquiring at various organizations about these people, sometimes the topic or the explanation was given to me of, well, there really isn't, they didn't contribute a lot to this area, or statements like that that are just sort of based on this sort of general idea of, well, there's nothing here that I can point to, therefore there must not be anything there at all, which of course is wildly inaccurate and not correct. So one of my goals for tonight is to just give the public a starting place for more study, because I had to sort through lots of sort of specialized sources, academic databases and things like this that the general public doesn't have the time or inclination to do. So that was one of my goals. Okay. I also want to point out that a lot of what we use and benefit from today and understand as inhabitants of this area are all based on native foundations. The Indians of the Potomac Valley had a powerful influence on colonial culture, which we're still following through on today. So indigenous agricultural techniques, construction techniques, language, we borrowed words and incorporated them into English. Even forms of government and oratory were incorporated into white settlements all over the Americas. And a lot of the survival skills, building different types of canoes, whether a dugout canoe, and here you see a dugout canoe in process at historic St. Mary's City in southern Maryland. Also hunting techniques, fishing techniques, foraging, herbal medicine. I mean, truly the survival and the thriving of the American colony was all built upon indigenous wisdom and expertise. So some of the groups that we would have seen here in this northwestern corner of Montgomery County's Ag Reserve, I'm also, for our purposes, going across the river into Loudoun County, bordering here, and then also a little bit over the Frederick County line, because of course these boundaries are less modern boundaries, and when we see a river, we often think of a border, right, between Virginia and Maryland. But in many cases with these communities, the rivers were like a main street or a thoroughfare or a highway. They weren't dividing. And in some cases, communities would live on opposite sides of the rivers, not as a dividing line. So this is a list I'm not going to read through, but just to give you an idea of the rich, different peoples, different cultures, different language groups, and so on and so forth that were just in this small corner of Montgomery County. It's really astounding. Sandy? Yes?
Did any of those have permanent settlements? I noticed it said some passed through.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
So you have
Yes.
a mixture of things going
Sure.
on.
You had people who were living here in permanent settlements. You also had peoples that were living here that were passing through, sometimes on seasonal migrations, like the Tuscarora would, before they moved out of North Carolina, they would pass through this area every year on their seasonal migration. You also had groups that moved due to being displaced because of either internal conflicts with other Native American groups, or when settlement started, pressures from settlement, people were moving around for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes there would also be hunting camps or fishing camps that were temporary and seasonal, so it was a variety of reasons. Yeah, just like today, you know, some people are here in Poolsville, like, I'm gonna pick on poor Kevin. Kevin's family's lived here in Poolsville a very long time, like this is their permanent community. Some people have probably moved here because of work or other reasons, and may not stay here very long, and may have to relocate again, so ancient and modern reasons. I included this slide in here for people that are unfamiliar with these archaeological time periods. These are the very broad time periods that we see represented in the artifacts here in this area, and also to give you the idea of how long people have been living in this corner of the agricultural reserve. A very, very long time. And for the same reasons why people enjoy living here, working here, enjoying, you know, all the beauty around here, it's the same reasons, right? We have the rivers, we have the fields, the forests, all of this wonderful stuff and resources. So I'm gonna skip to this one, but please, if you read the PowerPoint at home, take some time, it'll give you some context and help you to better understand some of the other details. I'm just being mindful of time. Okay. So to give you an idea of particularly the woodland era settlements, which are the ones that are closest in that archaeological timeline to our time and to the contact period when Europeans came, a lot of the villages in this area would have resembled this illustration. So you see the houses, which I'll show you in the next slide, a reconstruction of one, were called widgets. And often the villages were constructed in sort of a circular pattern around a large main plaza, which would have been used by everyone in the community. Sometimes these villages were palisaded, so you can see this one has the sort of fortification around it. Sometimes they were not palisaded. There is some debate among scholars and archaeologists about the function of these palisades. We look at them with our modern eyes and we think about like a fort, right? So it's meant to keep people out, but some suggest that perhaps it was also a symbolic purpose to sort of just mark the borders of the community. Here in the woodland period, we had three different main cultures. We had the Montgomery complex, which appears to be this group of cultures that were sort of the original inhabitants here. We had the Mason Island complex, which were groups of peoples who were originally down in the Shenandoah Valley, but they were displaced. So they came over the Blue Ridge here into this area. And eventually it's thought that most of the Montgomery complex peoples ended up moving down to the western shore of the Chesapeake, where they eventually became what would be more of the modern day, if you will, Piscataway Pinoy chiefdom. And some did return later, which I'll get into later. We also had the Luray or the Keyser complex, and this group in turn displaced that Mason Island group. So here again, going back to your question of who was the permanent inhabitants, people were moving in and moving out for various reasons over time. And it's believed that this final group, they were the last ones to permanently inhabit this area before the European colonists moved in. So here you have again some images from historic St. Mary's, their woodland Indian village, and one of the docents there. If you've not been to historic St. Mary's, please go. It's down in southern Maryland. It is delightful. The docents are well informed, they're dynamic, and they do a lot of hands-on learning of material culture and traditions. Like these widgets, you can see one in progress there with the framework. This one you can go into, and as much as possible, they construct things and tools using authentic techniques and authentic tools and authentic materials. With the exception of the mats here on the outside of this widget are actually rubber, because they found over time that the handmade woven mats were breaking down too quickly, and it was a lot of work for them to hand weave them with the amount of visitors coming to the museum. But this gives you an idea of those types of houses that we saw in that previous illustration. So generally, the late woodland people here in the middle Potomac Valley, what would their communities look like? And these would have been the peoples that were living here upon European contact and also after European contact. And that's another, I think, sort of myth or missing piece of knowledge in all of this. It's not that, the moment someone came from England and their foot touched the soil of what would later be the state of Maryland, that all the Native Americans poof vanished. No, there's information out there that deserves more study and more detail about how these various groups interacted with each other here in this area. And that's something that I'm hoping to learn more about as well. But in general, these late woodland peoples built semi-permanent or permanent villages that were usually along the floodplains of sort of major river valleys. So I mentioned McKee-Besher earlier. If you've ever gone down to McKee-Besher, I mean, that's exactly what it is. You're along the Potomac River, you have these broad fields with really rich soil, right? It would have been great for cultivation, for agriculture, and that's exactly why these people lived here. And so they would cultivate things like corn, beans, squash, as well as helping along wild food sources as well, so sort of stewarding those as well. The rivers, of course, were sources of food items, fish, shellfish, waterfowl, and then smaller camps would be set up beyond the main villages for them to procure other things. So like hunting and fishing, they would have smaller temporary camps. And as you saw in the illustration, most of these permanent villages were based on sort of circular or an oval-shaped model. They would have houses, they would have refuse pits, they would have burials, so on and so forth. The widgets, the houses, would have a fire going 24/7, year-round, even in humid Maryland summers, not for the heat, but for the smoke, because the smoke inside would rise up to the top, and then in the top would be shelving. And if you had any food that you wanted to store at the top and you wanted to keep pests out of it, the smoke would sort of deter the pests, and it would help to prolong the life of your food. Also, these widgets were amazingly constructed. If we look at them with our modern eyes, we may think about, what was that, the 3 little pigs and the big bad wolf? We may think, oh, the wolf would definitely blow that down, but it wouldn't at all, because these were built with very flexible timbers. They were selected because of their flexibility. And so if there was a large storm coming along with high winds, if there was heavy snow, because it could flex, because it could bend, it could easily endure through any kind of severe weather. So these saplings would be tied with rawhide. They would use cattails. They would use in particular red cedar and locust because they were flexible and they also lasted. And they would have the mats on top as well. And one colonist who visited a Native American village observed that even in a bitterly cold winter, when people were struggling to stay warm, that the interior of these witches was warm as stoves. The other interesting thing to think about is the dynamic aspect of living and the ways of life for the Native peoples. We think of someone's permanent village like Poolsville, probably most of us, we probably have one house that we live in year-round somewhere. But here it was more flexible depending upon the season and depending upon the resources and the health of the land around the community. So there could be regular cycles during the year, so such as hunting during the winter. People could move around to different camps depending on what time of year it was and what their role was in the community. Also fishing during early summer, or when you would have certain runs of different kinds of fish. And some of these fishing and hunting parties could be as large as 300. So it could be a really big deal, for sure. Groups then that had splintered off for these various purposes would reassemble for things like major planting and harvest cycles, where the whole community would come back to pitch in for this food production. The hunting camps were often situated by rivers. If they were further from the shore, more inland, they would be situated near springs. And one interesting thing about peoples in this area is they did use dogs that were trained that helped with both hunting and helped with guarding communities. And you'll see some of the sites here in this area have dog burials as well, which is very interesting. Another nice thing about the communities and being so dynamic depending upon the community's needs and what was going on in the ecosystem at the time, if there was a challenging time, like a drought or something like that, these larger communities, which would be more of an impact on the local ecosystem, they would disperse into smaller groups and they would spread out so that they could more easily take care of their community members while not having such an impact on an already stressed ecosystem. And then once sort of that tough period was over with, they could then reassemble. So it was really a dynamic and responsive way to live. Regular burns kept forests open, rejuvenated the soil, and attracted wildlife. Large trees could be girdled in order to create cornfields. So a lot of the open spaces, for example, again, I'm going to use McKee-Besher, that are fields today, likely have been fields for a very long time through this native stewardship of the land and through native agricultural techniques. Over time, a lot of village fields and then further afield farm fields would be allowed to go fallow probably about every 5 to 6 years, just again moving around to optimize the fertility of the land and to sort of give the local ecosystem a chance to rejuvenate itself. So a lot of expertise and knowledge in all of this.
Yeah, I thought the same.
Oh, thank you. So, we think of, here's a big tree, I can't have it, I'm gonna cut it down, right? But if you have limited materials, that's gonna be really difficult to do with a stone axe, for example. So girdling the tree, you could then tie the tree and you could burn the tree around the area that you would typically think about cutting down. So you can sort of burn a stripe around it and then you could tie it. You could just keep tying it until you basically wear the tree down and then it falls on its own. As opposed to sitting there and cutting the tree. So it's almost like a tourniquet for a tree. Yeah, strangling the tree. That sounds so violent. But yes. I mean, it is. You are ending the tree's life. Yeah. But yeah, and anyone that has a question, please feel free to raise your hand. Food waste. I mentioned already the agricultural expertise. Here in this area, as well as many other areas, with native agriculture across the Americas. Tobacco was a crop that was planted that was used for ceremonial purposes primarily. And then what was known now as sort of the three sisters, so squash, corn, and beans were grown together. If anyone here is a gardener, you know that those three crops are sort of natural helpers to each other, and along with other crop items as well. As I said before, they also stewarded wild food sources. If anyone in here enjoys foraging, and foraging responsibly, I hope, you know that you have to be careful how you are taking wild foods because you can really impact those food sources. The fishing and hunting camps I mentioned before were also sites of food preservation. So often it wasn't just that we're catching the food or we're hunting the food at this site and then we're taking it back to our main home base and preserving it. Generally it was, we're catching it here, we're hunting it here, we're also preserving it. So it would have been a busy place for butchering and smoking and things like this. How was food stored? Ceramics and boards. If it was a dried food, for example, like dried corn, it could be buried in the ground and used for later. It could be stored in the top of the witchet where the smoke would deter the pests. And if you're going to cook something, you could either have your pot there and you could put your pot in the fire, or you could heat stones and drop them into the pot. So there are a couple different ways you could do that. This image, this image is from the Jefferson-Patterson Park and Museum, also in Southern Maryland. They have a lot of artifacts from this local area. And this really large pot that you see here is a cooking pot from Mason Island, which is right here in the Potomac, adjacent to Annington, which you will pass if you drive down White's Ferry Road. And that's another wonderful place to visit if you've never been. Okay, Sandy. Some pre-colonial Piscataway beliefs, and as much as possible with this research, I have tried to get my information from Piscataway oral histories and Piscataway peoples, and Gabrielle Tyack has been a really great resource for that. So one of the beliefs, the turtle was the main symbol for the tribe in general, though separate clans, smaller groups, may have had their own symbols. For example, the turkey is one that has appeared. And some of the larger ceremonies were the green corn ceremony held in the summer, the Feast of the Dead held in the fall, the Midwinter Festival, and the Awakening of Mother Earth ceremony in the spring. You can also generalize and say that there was an attachment to and a deep love for family members, even after they were deceased, a belief in the power of dreams, the ability of certain individuals to obtain higher spiritual powers, and real emphasis on maintaining balance and animism. Tobacco, as I said before, was not something that was used recreationally or in great quantities. It was believed that the smoke from tobacco would carry prayers up to heaven, and that smoke from cedar, in particular, which was another sacred plant, would purify. Another belief that was well documented was the Huskanal coming of age ritual, which most of the research points to being primarily for adolescent boys, but I found a couple sources that said that that may be an overgeneralization and that adolescent girls may have had their own coming of age ritual as well. Okay, now we're getting into the actual sites. So as I said before, I mainly focused here in this northwestern corner of the Ag Reserve, as well as sort of the border across the river in Virginia, and then a little bit above the Frederick County line. Obviously, there's way more beyond this sort of section, but I was trying to keep it local as much as possible. To give you a little bit of context, the earliest site was dated to over 13,000 years ago. So we are walking and working and living and playing amongst millennia of history here. And I think that's just amazing. And as I said before, what started off as something, a little blog post I wrote, and said there were 6 villages, and that blew my mind. I've found, through digging around, online, more than 60 documented sites just in this area. And in organizing this, I tried to broadly sort of start upriver and sort of head downriver as an organizational path. I want to point out before we move on this really cool map that was made by Loudoun County historian Eugene Scheel. And this is a map that he drew of Native American sites in Loudoun County. And I would just tell you, if I had a magic wand, I would wish that someone would come along here and could make a similar map here on the other side of the river. So these are some of the sites that I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, and some of these larger sites have multiple smaller sites within them. I know I'm an English teacher and I'm not good at math, but I'm not that bad at math either. Because you're probably like, she just said 60, but that goes up to like 36. Okay, thank you, Sandy. As I said before, Native American expertise and knowledge laid the groundwork for colonial society, but also laid the groundwork of a lot of what we use and benefit from today. And one big example of that is Native American trails. I read a book last year about trails in general, and this quote really stood out to me. For many indigenous peoples, trails were not just a means of travel. They were the veins and arteries of culture. For societies relying on oral tradition, the land served as a library of botanical, zoological, etymological, genealogical, spiritual, cosmological, and esoteric knowledge. In guiding people through that wondrous archive, trails became a rich cultural creation and a source of knowledge in themselves. Although that system of knowledge has largely been subsumed by empire and entombed in asphalt, threads of it can still be found running through the forest if one only knows where to look. And, when we think of a trail today, we think of generally people hiking for pleasure, right? So generally these trails are going to take us to a nice viewpoint or maybe a historical site or something like that. However, Native American trails were constructed for other reasons, including efficiency of movement, to have access to sacred sites, including pauperances, which I'll get to what that is in a minute, food sources, to visit family groups, to access trade networks. And this was part of a very sophisticated trade network that stretched thousands of miles. I think many people in the modern era, with our reliance on cars and such, we think, well, geez, people didn't have cars. And the earlier cultures, they didn't even have horses. They probably stayed very locally, and that's not the case at all. It was a very extensive trade network. Also, trails could be constructed to avoid enemy territory or haunted areas. Pauperances were basically stone cairns that were constructed at sites where something of significance had occurred. So again, if you were traveling down that trail, every time you would pass that pauperance that was, commemorating this event, you would stop and you would recite what had happened at that site. So again, another way, and very much the landscape coming to life, and the landscape being something that could be read and could be experienced. Yes. That's a good question, and I'm not sure. I had it come up. Thank you. It's okay. You have to go. You have to go. Thank you. She asked what language the word pauperance came from. I think it's an Algonquian term. I found it in my research most often coming up associated with the Piscataway Pinoy, which they were part of that Algonquian language group. So that would be my guess, but it's only a guess. Yes?
Could you speak more to what these look like? Were they stone?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they were stacks of stones, and oftentimes they could be very deep in the forest. And from what I understand is some of them still exist in this region, but they're not mapped out for obvious reasons with people coming in and meddling with them. I will say in doing some of my oral history research for my book project, I did interview someone who's lived in this area for decades. And she and her family once lived at Annington. And she said in the 1960s, in archaeology or anthropology, I can't remember what she said, a professor came from American University and was asking about different stone constructions and piles of stones on that particular site. Speaking of trails, trails often became roads. And you may be surprised to learn some of the roads that you find yourself frustrated on a regular basis in your commute are actually very, very old and extensively traveled Native American trails. Route 15 is one of those. It's referred to as the Great Warriors Path. And this was a major north-south Native American trail system that went across, thousands of miles in different tribal groups and affiliations, all the way from western New York down to the Carolinas. This includes the river crossing at Nolan's Ferry, so right over the Frederick County line. And that Nolan's Ferry site is one of the oldest sites in the entire state that has been documented to date. It's over 13,000 years ago is the oldest evidence that's been located there at the Nolan's Ferry area. The Tuscarora Indians used the Great Warriors Path to migrate from North Carolina to New York, both seasonally and on their final migration when they were forced out. Route 355 is another road that was once originally a Native American trail running all the way from Frederick to Bethesda. River Road as well, including the original path of River Road, which here we go with McKee Besher again, Hunting Quarter Road. That was originally part of the path of River Road. If you like looking at old maps, you find a 1716 map, you'll see it labeled as the Tahaji Trail, a pre-settlement Indian trail, which led from Frederick all the way down, tracing the Potomac, Rockville, Old Georgetown Road, into now Georgetown, which was once known as Tahoga, which means an official entrance, like a checkpoint or an entryway. And so that was the official entrance to the area down there, and if you were visiting from outside of that tribe, you were expected to check in there. And if you didn't check in there, make yourself known, you were kind of thought to be sneaking around, probably up to no good. The Poolsville area itself was occupied by Native Americans for millennia, and the original Main Street, which, today we think of Fisher Avenue as being the Main Street, but if you look over here, the road that runs behind Wayland Commons, in front of the new town hall, that used to be Main Street, and that was laid upon an original Native American trail. Sandy? Oh, yeah. Sure.
Is there any correlation between the River Road Trail?
I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. I would say Tahaji Trail.
And the canal, because the canal ran from Frederick or beyond Frederick down to Georgetown.
I wouldn't be surprised. If you couldn't hear her, she had a good point of, is there a connection between the C&O Canal towpath and any of these trails? And I would say likely. I haven't found specific documentation for that. But it stands to reason that there would be a thoroughfare running fairly close to the river. And there are some like Malcolm-Monocacy Road and others like that.
I know that we flew going from, I don't know where, Pennsylvania to Baltimore was really a buffalo trip.
Yep.
travel on in the pursuit of the buffalo.
Yep, yep. Thank you for that. You couldn't hear her. She said she found out that Route 40, which runs through Frederick and some other places, was originally a buffalo trail that the Native Americans would use in their pursuit and in hunting. And that's something I learned from that trail book too, is a lot of Native American trails were based on, originally were animal trails, which is genius and is a feature of indigenous wisdom worldwide, no matter what animal. You know, animals are going to take the route of least resistance, the most efficient route, and will often go to places like sources of water that are of interest to people as well. So indigenous peoples worldwide would keep an eye on where the animal's going, and then they would often, if it was a good path for their own uses, they would then sort of take over that animal path and make it their own. It's really cool. So another thing that we can observe in the landscape, or maybe I should say the waterscape, the aquascape today, are the fish weirs. Anybody ever gone down to the Monocacy or the Potomac and seen the fish weirs? Yes, they're very cool. Here's one that I took a picture of last summer when the water was quite low. You can see it's a V, that's how they're shaped. So these are basically also called fish traps. So the water would come downstream, they would build the V, and then there would be a space here at the point of the V, where you could put a basket, you could put a net, and you would just naturally be able to catch fish. This would also be an easy way for you to sort of keep fish there alive in the water. So rather than you're hungry, you need to go catch some fish, the fish are already right there, and you can just take them out and you have dinner. So genius. Yeah.
You're saying when we see those are probably man-made?
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Oh yeah. For sure. Yes.
You can see those on Google Earth when the river's low.
Oh yeah.
The ones below Nolan's Ferry, it's just a series.
Oh yeah.
It's really cool, and they're so old.
Yeah,
Can they
they're-
go back to that time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can see the Warrior's Path too.
Yeah.
When the river's low, you'll see, you know where the rocks are below by the current. And you can see a line straight across the river, right below Nolan's Ferry, the ramp.
That's so cool.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you for
very
that.
cool.
Yeah, when you think, like, these are thousands of years old, how well constructed they are with all of the mucking about that has gone on in that river and the huge floods with all the trees and debris, but they're still there and they're still functional, which I'll get into in a minute.
So why would reasonable people blow up and destroy them?
Oh, yeah. So there are 9 of these remaining between Point of Rocks and Seneca. There used to be far more in the Potomac in particular. If you know your canal history a little bit, you like to see canal history, you probably know that George Washington and some other folks had an older canal dream, and also had a dream of making the Potomac River more navigable during the early colonial era. And as part of that effort, this local man named James Rumsey was charged with removing a lot of these boulders, fish weirs, and other obstructions from the river, all the way from Cumberland, down to Georgetown.
That is about
And in the 1930s, interestingly enough, Maryland's Department of Natural Resources issued restrictions. There were lots of people who were using these fish weirs, and they felt that people were overfishing, and that they were sort of abusing this features in the river, but people kept using them regardless. They said, we don't need to listen to these people, like, I'm gonna catch the fish how I wanna catch the fish. So in retaliation, Maryland DNR blew up or destroyed many of those remaining fish weirs here in the middle Potomac nearby. I don't know a lot about this. This was one line from a source that I found, someone who had studied the fish weirs around Brunswick and Point Rock specifically. But it really interested me because I thought, what was going on in the 1930s that had people so interested in fishing? Right? So that made me extra mad. I'm like, people are just hungry. Also, fish weirs and fishing. In this area, both dugout canoes, large felled trees, as well as bark canoes were both used by groups in this area. If you go on our side of the river here in Maryland to White's Ford, or on the other side of the river, which goes by the name of Piscataway Crossing Regional Park, get it together, Maryland, that area, the ford, was used by Native American groups for millennia. And I want to point that out again, in addition to a lot of the roadways and the highways that we benefit from, a lot of these river crossings weren't ones that were arbitrarily put there, or it wasn't something that often a colonist said this is a good spot for river crossing. It was often based on an established river crossing that had been used for millennia by Native Americans. And this particular ford was one of those. Now on the Virginia side, I found evidence of Native occupation, and that's why they have the name on that side of the river. However, there's no documentation about Native occupation on the Maryland side, which to me doesn't make much sense at all. I also want to say that these opinions are solely mine and are not those of any of the good people listed on here or here. So you know what they say about opinions. That is my opinion. So again, this presentation is based on what is out there today and what is successful today. There's so much stuff that I'm sure is still out there that needs attention, that needs study. And here, there used to be more fish weirs at this crossing, but George Washington had the fish weirs at that site dismantled, again, as part of that Potomac River navigation process. And good old White's Ferry, which is now resting, shall we say, was also the site of a Native American river crossing. Sugarloaf Mountain, woo boy, this is one I went down a personal rabbit hole on this week. Let me keep an eye on my tongue. So Sugarloaf Mountain is a monodock, right? So this whole landscape is pretty flat, and here you have this mountain, this isolated mountain, a monodock, rising out of the landscape. So you think, surely this had some major significance for the native peoples in this area. Like, wow, what a dramatic and beautiful natural feature. I have not been able to find any information about that. If you know some of Sugarloaf Mountain's history, you know that it was heavily used as an industrial site in the early colonial era. So whatever evidence may have been on that mountain in terms of some of those paulkerances that we talked about earlier, or even petroglyphs, rock art, which we will talk about later, were likely destroyed, or perhaps they're just haven't been uncovered. However, in some of my work at FCC discussing with a former Maryland Archaeological Society president, she said that whole area around the mountain is just dense with Native American sites and Native American artifacts. And if you like going there, you know there's that lovely little lake right there that's gated off at the base of the mountain. That's not a natural pond or lake. There's a spring that starts up on the hill near where the little stone mausoleum is, where the Strongs are currently buried. And Mr. Strong had that spring dammed to create that little willow pond, in 1910. Before the pond was created there, it was a field that was dense with arrowheads, lots and lots of arrowheads. This illustration is one that's of great personal interest to me. This is an 1816 watercolor illustration. The name of the artist is escaping me. This is a local man by the name of David Moody, who's biracial. He's African American and Native American. And he was a collier. He lived here on Sugarloaf Mountain with his family and worked creating charcoal to fuel some of those industrial efforts there on the mountain. And interestingly enough, with some of the funds that he made from working here on Sugarloaf Mountain, he was able to purchase property nearby, and he was able to start the local African American community of Mount Ephraim. And his log cabin has been preserved, and it's still on the grounds of the Hallowwood Retreat Center. Guess where I want to go visit over my spring break. So I want to find out more because I haven't been able to find any documentation of Native American peoples that stayed put And that's a big myth, again, with this history is poof, everybody's gone. Where larger groups sometimes would migrate together, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But people intermarried, people worked together, some people decided to stick around. So I'm trying to find out more information about Mr. Moody and his family to see if we can get more of his story out there, because it's really, really fascinating. Okay.
There's a rock at the outside of the Smithsonian
Yes.
Museum.
From Sugarloaf, yes, yes. She said if you go to the Native American Museum in Washington D.C., the Smithsonian, they have a rock from Sugarloaf Mountain there. The Monocacy Aqueduct area is really rich in Native American history. Who likes to go down there? I like to go down there and watch the sunset. It's really beautiful. And a nice place if you like to be on the water too. Around that area, in the river itself, the Monocacy was a major north-south route for Native Americans for hunting, fishing, and traveling. There was a really busy Native American trading post there, which was later run by settlers. And in 1712, on the north bank of the Monocacy, near the Potomac, a Swiss explorer, von Graffin Reed, met Martin Chartier, who was a French-Canadian man that had married a local Native American woman, and he was living there in the Native American village. And it's not clear what designation this Native American village at this site was. One source said it was either Piscataway, who had fled from Charles County and come up this way. Another source said that it was a Shawnee village. That's unclear. I also found in the history an account of a white shop owner at this area quarreling with a Native American, and in the quarrel it got quite heated and he murdered the man. He was arrested, however, he was tried and he was pardoned after paying with goods, which to us sounds a little suspicious, like, oh, you took a man's life and you just paid with goods. But in my research of the Native American justice system at this time, in many tribes that was acceptable. The death penalty, as we understand it in modern times or even in ancient times in other cultures, was not a thing in many Native cultures. That was considered an acceptable thing because you were taking the earning potential or the contributing potential of that person to the betterment of the larger community group. And so that would be considered a fitting punishment. But I haven't been able to find any more information about it. That's another thing I would like to find out more about, because it's certainly a compelling story.
So I noticed in your presentation that you speak of Piscataway, Shawnee, Delaware, Chicago, Tuscarora, and then you say colonials or whites. Who were they? I mean, what were
Yeah.
their tribe?
Yeah.
What were the tribe?
That's a good point. So here, she had a good point. She said, you know, in discussing the Native Americans, the indigenous people in this area, I've been identifying various tribes. But when I'm talking about the white settlers or the colonists, I'm not mentioning their tribes. But I can say here in this area, Poolsville area, was primarily settled by people who were of English and Scottish descent first. Later on, when times got tough in Ireland, then you had a lot of people coming from Ireland. Also, you started to see some people who originally came from Germany and really heavily settled in more Pennsylvania and sort of bordering parts of Western Maryland, particularly Pennsylvania, because it started to get, land prices started to get more expensive there, and so some people started trickling down to Maryland and to Western Maryland from Pennsylvania, seeking more land and seeking better land prices. And so later on, so it could have been Germans, it could have been Irish, and originally mostly English and Scottish.
So whites weren't really whites until they came to Potomac.
Yes. Well, we could get into the history of race and racism, particularly in Maryland, which is very interesting. I will say, I'm trying to keep an eye on my time, but I will say when the colony of Maryland was established, it was not established with the draconian racial laws that, you know, later came with the mid-Atlantic slave trade. And then later with the Jim Crow movement. If you were a black person in the colony of Maryland early on, you had the same rights as a white person in the colony of Maryland early on. And you could intermarry, you could buy property, you could do all those things. It wasn't until a little bit later that the powers that be decided that in a power move, that they were going to start restricting people's rights based on their visual appearance, their race. So.
Not only restricting some, but giving preferential treatment to others.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
What did you say?
She said not just restricting people, but also giving some preferential treatment based on the color of their skin. Yeah, and you can look into that. Maryland has really interesting history in terms of how the laws changed over time and why the laws changed over time, because they didn't used to be so strict, these strict separations. All right, Sandy. Another site that's not only bordering the water, but in the water as well. Potomac has all these amazing islands, one of them being Lower Mason Island, which is divided into the upper and lower Mason Islands. White's Ford is above the head of the island, so we're talking about that area where the fish weir had been removed. There are 2 fish weirs nearby Mason Island. There's some very old Clovis points that have been found on Mason Island too. And Clovis points are sort of like the oldest prehistoric version of arrowheads, if you will. There are also 2 sites and burials on Mason 1, early and late woodland sites. Burials and turtle shell ladles have been found as well. And this is the channel between the 2 islands. I took this in August when the river was really low.
Did you walk there
Yes.
from the canal?
No, I got on a boat and then I walked on the
Oh.
I mean, maybe I could have walked there, but I'm not trying to get Lyme disease, so I wouldn't walk through all that in the summer. And that large storage pot that you saw in the previous slide with that old guy, my dad, and that little kid, my youngest daughter, at Jefferson Patterson, here it is. They found it in pieces, they reconstructed it, and here it is. It was quite large, and it would have been used for food storage. Harrison Island. Now I'm very excited. I should have brought the book. If you are enjoying this, if you like local history, there's a brand new book. I want to say it came out in December 2023 by Maryland historian, archaeologist Dennis Curry. And it is about Heater's Island. And I'll get to that in a minute. Oh, shoot. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. I didn't talk about Heater's Island today because it was too far upriver, but this image is related to that. So Heater's Island, which you can see if you take the Point of Rocks Bridge, right? You can look down in the river and you see that island. That's Heater's Island. Some people also call it Conoy Island. That was a large outpost of Piscataway Village for a number of years. And Dennis Curry has just written a book about it, and it's called Canavest, Canavest, because that Swiss explorer I mentioned back there at Monocacy Aqueduct, he came upriver to explore the rivers, the islands, and he called Heater's Island Canavest. So Dennis Curry has written an entire book about that Piscataway Village on Heater's Island. You can check that out. But Harrison Island, if you go to White's Ferry, that's the island. If you look downriver from White's Ferry, you can see it right there. It's also known as Black Walnut Island or Walnut Island. This is the one that's along Haunted House Bend, there on the C&O Canal, right across the river from Balls Bluff, that old Balls Bluff. And just below Balls Bluff, there's a fish weir that's thousands of years old, one of the oldest. In 1697, Piscataway came under the protection of their former enemies, the Seneca, And the Tayak, which was basically what we would think of as the chief or the emperor, their leader or their ruler, announced that the Piscataway and the Seneca are now one people. And this is something that happened with a lot of different tribes over time. They would form alliances with former enemies, or as numbers dwindled for various reasons, they would come together and they would unify in order to sort of have a united front against other tribes that they didn't have such a great relationship with, or in order to leverage their own powers against the colonial groups. So there was a lot of tension at this time. The Piscataway preferred to reside with those former indigenous enemies and to try together to rid themselves of the common threat, which would be the Maryland English. They lived on Harrison Island in Potomac, and they later proceeded up to Peters Island. And one source I found also said that the Tuscarora, for a time, lived on Harrison Island.
Good question.
Yeah.
Your picture of the horses sparked a question I think.
Yeah.
The Native Americans here before the colonists, they didn't have horses, right?
That's a great question. So, Sandy's got to cite that question. So, here in this part of what is now the United States, they did not have horses until really mainly the English came. There are some indications that earlier Spanish colonial efforts, particularly more down like in Florida and the Southwest and the Central West, that those tribes had access to horses on a wider, more ready basis than the ones in this area. So it was much at a later date here.
So they didn't have it as a transportation mode.
For the most part, no, it was all just foot. Yeah, for a very long time.
They had dogs, and they used the dogs.
Oh yeah, you can use dogs for carts. You've probably
Yeah,
seen
is
that,
there-
or use dogs as like a pack animal in a way. Yep. But as far as like an animal to ride, yeah. Another site which I found, and this is Woodstock Park off of Weishi Road as part of this. In the 90s, I don't want anybody to get excited, this was back in the 90s, okay? Montgomery County was looking to create a new landfill site. And so they have to do a study, as they should, to see what's the historical foundation on where this thing might go. And so this is what has been published. One was dubbed the Huang Prehistoric Camp, Musser Prehistoric Camp, the Draper Prehistoric Camp, and then there are quite a few lithic scatters. Lithic material would be stone, so you can make arrowheads with it, you can make grinding tools with it, you can make axe heads and these types of things. Obviously, you're not going to pick up just any old stone off the ground and use for this. There was a lot of understanding about what stones were best for what, and people would seek out different deposits of stone. So these lithic scatters were evidence that these ancient peoples were coming to these sources of stone, basically quarrying them and using them for tools. That caught my eye as well. So I'm assuming maybe there were the lead people that were studying these, but there was no explanation for the names. Probably. She's saying these names are not Native American names, and I said they didn't explain why, but probably the archaeologists. Yeah. All right, Sandy. Oh, I gotta watch my time. Now, this area, I'm really excited about. This area in particular is so dense with Native American sites, and this is right here. If you take River Road, where it turns into gravel, and you're going down the narrow gravel rustic River Road, and it takes that sharp turn up Mount Nebo Road, it's right along that area. Sort of like the eastern stretches of McKee-Vesher, and also where that sod farm is, the Summit Hill? Is it Summit Hill? Summit Hall. I was like, Hill, that doesn't sound right, thank you. So there are 8 documented sites just in this area. One of the sites is the Shepherd site, and that is the namesake for Shepherd Cord marked ceramics. So when archaeologists are studying these groups of people, one way that they can identify what group of people it was is by the type of pottery techniques and features that they're using. And so shepherd cord mark ceramics have a certain feature about it, so they can say, you know, it's this cultural group that was living in this area at this time, and these are some of their characteristics. The cord mark just means, think about soft clay, and you can decorate that soft clay with a variety of ways. You could press your fingernails into it, you could get stones, you could carve into it, you could also get cordage, and you could press that cordage into the wet pottery to make marks. And that is one of the features of shepherd cord from the shepherd cultural group. But this area was a major land occupancy, and it was under continual habitation from around 12,000 BC, not 1200, 12,000 BC to 1400. And you see just layers of history here, from archaic to early woodland. That Montgomery Focus site I talked about as these people being the original inhabitants of this area. So many artifacts and burials. This area's sites were abandoned around 1300, likely because the Mason Island folks were moving in, and then those Luray and Keyser Island folks were moving into the area. Later, Susquehannocks were even coming into this area from DC. So there was a lot of movement. This was really dynamic. And this also tells us that this particular stretch of river, and the island in the river, had a lot of resources and had a lot of features that made it appealing for all of these groups. You know, like realtors say, location, 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 same thing. All of these groups of people were saying location, 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 wow, about this section. Before Common Era, that's what people say now instead of before Christ, to make it more inclusive of people with different spiritual beliefs. The last bullet point, which was really interesting to me, generally these groups of peoples didn't have really elaborate grave goods for the most part. When we think of other cultures, like maybe ancient Egypt, where you think of the royalty in particular being buried with all of this elaborate jewelry, being prepared in these very specific and elaborate ways, being given the goods that they needed for the afterlife, we don't see that so much with these groups of peoples. Generally, people were buried as they were. Occasionally, they might have like a necklace. They might be buried with a pot. Not a lot of stuff was being buried with people. And things that were being buried with them were generally utilitarian, or if it was ornamental, it was pretty simple, like beads, like a beaded necklace or something like that. However, this burial, one of these burials here, is similar to one at the Catoctin Creek site up the river in what is now Frederick County. And this was an adolescent female with a wealth of Marginella shell beads at her wrist, neck, and elbow, and tubular bone beads in the pattern of a headdress underneath her skull. So we see these two burials, in our minds far apart, but their minds probably not that far apart, with really similar patterns, but we don't have any context for it. But we can notice the differences between those two burials and your average burials of people of similar or different ages, and it really stands out. So another interesting history mystery.
Where is this adolescent female?
I'm sorry?
Where is this adolescent female's bone?
This is in this section.
Where are her bones now?
That one, I think they reburied her. Some of these, and we'll get to this in a little bit, some of these people were excavated in ways that were not at all respectful. And many of them that were excavated in earlier times ended up in the collection of the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, which is where many of them are today. Some of them are also in the collection at the Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, which is in Southern Maryland. That's the one with the cool jar we keep looking at. And in the 90s, I can't remember the acronym, but in the 90s there was national legislation passed, which was basically an effort to address the fact that a lot of particularly indigenous peoples' ancestors had been unearthed in ways that were not respectful and had been removed from their final resting places, and sometimes were put on display or were just put in museum collections. And so this was meant to be a repatriation of human remains to the proper tribes and to their, their descendants. However, depending on the dynamics, the modern dynamics of the tribes and their affiliations, it's not as clear cut all the time. So for example, I don't want to get into it because it's not my place, but there's a lot of, I'm choosing my words carefully, there's a lot of complexity amongst, in particular, the modern Piscataway, and who in these different bands of Piscataway has a right or a claim to these remains. And because it's not clear cut which group does, with the example of these remains that are down at the Jefferson Patterson Museum, they're still there. Because there's no clear answer about who gets them and why. But I will say that what they've tried to do is they've been removed from public display. They're not on public display, and they are not, being photographed or displayed or anything like that in ways that are disrespectful. So there they are until there's some sort of tribal accord that can be, an answer to this question. So it's very complicated, and obviously it's very delicate and very sensitive. So I'm trying to be very careful how I answer that question. Yes.
The law you're looking for is NAGPRA.
Thank you.
How'd you
Yes.
say?
NAGPRA, it's N-A-G-P-R-A.
Yeah. NAGPRA. Yeah.
Is that an acronym?
It's an acronym for Native American Ritual. Okay. But yeah, anything sensitive like that.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So, is it documented where in the mountain roads and where the burial site was?
Say that again?
The marker for where in that area that was stuff.
No.
You don't have.
So here's the other thing that's complicated about this research, and there's lots of stuff that's complicated about this research. But some of it is, this is very sensitive because this is ancient archaeological history, so it's very delicate. It's also a group that has been fundamentally disrespected and in many cases deliberately erased from the historical record. And these are people's ancestors, and there's people even today that are unscrupulous that would be like, oh look, this is where this burial is, I'm gonna go, dig it up. And so a lot of this stuff, they'll just have a vague description of where it is. And you have to be like a registered, vetted archaeologist in order to get more details. The public record is very general. I mean, I even tried to get access to some of the records because I'm like, I'm an academic, I'm an educator, I'm writing, and researching in this area and sharing this information with the public, but I didn't cut the mustard. So, and that's the thing too about I think making this history more accessible and making it more visible in public, there has to be a balance to where somebody can drive by a site, or when somebody's hiking and they can say, oh wow, this was this amazing vibrant home where these people lived for millennia, like this is amazing, but not so specific that somebody can say, oh, well, I'm gonna, dig right here and see if I can find some beads, for example, which we'll get into in a minute. All right, Sandy. Speaking of burial sites, this was something new. I'm a lifelong Marylander. I didn't realize that there are burial mounds in this area. That's what I said. I have not found any that have been documented on this side of the river, but I did find just south of Leesburg, there are burial mounds, which oral tradition says are possibly for the Delaware tribe. And apparently there's also a burial mound somewhere on the grounds of the Torara Winery. And it's been observed that these mounds are perfectly round, so they're not something that would be naturally occurring, they're clearly man-made, and that often the soil composition of these mounds will be very pebbly soil, or very pebbly stones, I guess I should say, pebbly pebbles, is a little silly. But that the people who would come after to pay their respects would put these pebbles on these mounds. And so, the soil in the area wouldn't have those pebbles because the pebbles were brought there and were placed there deliberately. And one source said that people that live nearby this particular mound that's near Burt's Corner outside of Leesburg for years would observe Native American visitors coming particularly at certain special times of the year and leaving small gifts, especially in the early morning and the late evenings. And related to this, it's said, again, oral history, that somewhere around the confluence of Goose Creek and Little River, on the Leesburg side there's thought to be some type of major battle there between the Catawba and the Delawares, maybe in the 1500s or 1600s. But again, this is oral history. I haven't been able to find any more details than that. And on Four Streams Golf Club in Bellsville, I found one tiny mention. It just said that there's burials on the golf club property. All right, Sandy. I'm sorry? Say that again?
The golf club is on the Native American Cemetery property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of golf clubs around the
I mean, a lot of places where we walk. Yeah.
Well, plus that terrain has been altered in such a way now.
Oh, yeah.
We watched it being built. We lived in it.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh,
They changed everything.
yeah.
Huge machinery.
Well, I can say too, I don't know about Native American, but where the high school was built, apparently the high school was built on some type of cemetery, is how the oral history goes. That there's a cemetery that's been lost there. Yes, I know that one. Yeah, part of Route 15 too, up around Potomac Furnace, was built over an African American cemetery. Yeah, there's a lot of that, and it's still going on. Selden Island, which is also along that stretch, going back to that really dense stretch there, is home to Walker Prehistoric Village, which is on the National Registry of Historic Places, which is sort of one of the highest, designations you can get for a historical feature in this country. And that was the first permanent settlement identified in the entire state of Maryland. And apparently this site is really pivotal for understanding the entire context of the development of the Powhatan Confederacy in the whole Tidewater region, the Chesapeake Tidewater region. So the Powhatan Confederacy was more down in Virginia along the bay. You may have heard of a person referred to as Pocahontas, which was not her accurate name, but she was part of that Powhatan Confederacy. So again, this very sophisticated trade network going on here, and this village right here on this island in the river was a major linchpin to that. So it's also a key to reconstruct constructing those prehistoric trade networks here in the whole Potomac Valley. There's a lot of features about it that are interesting to people who enjoy history, and there's an idea that it may have been the last village occupied in this area before the inhabitants moved out. So a lot of dense occupation. It was a palisaded village, like we saw with the circular central plaza, and there's a proto-ossuary on this island. And an ossuary is basically a secondary burial. So someone would pass away, they would receive their death rites, and their corpse sometimes would be placed on a, sorry guys, I'm getting tired, on a, what's the word? Yes, thank you. Like a pyre. They wouldn't necessarily be burned, but they would decompose. The flesh would sometimes it would be in a charnel house. The flesh would fall away, or sometimes they could be buried underground, and decomposition would occur. And at a later date, their bones would be collected, and their bones would be cleaned, and then they would be interred in an ossuary, just the bones. This is not a practice that was commonly done in this area at all. It was more down in southern Maryland and more along the Chesapeake Bay. And Dennis Curry, that archaeologist and historian I was telling you about, he has a whole book about ossuaries in Maryland, if that practice interests you. But this really sticks out because this is the only thing close to an ossuary that we see in this whole area at all. So it really stands out. The other thing, which is very sad, there are many graves on this island. They're extremely dense. And archaeologists believe that this is sort of an early marker of the very early European contact and the amount of pestilence, basically, that was starting to hit people, even though there was no direct contact, that the indigenous peoples' systems just couldn't stand up to the European pathogens. And so it was racing through these groups, through these big trade networks, even though the peoples didn't know what the causes were. So this is a thought about the reasoning behind these deaths. And you can see here are some of the artifacts that were found here, including this really interesting, it's like an animal head. And a lot of the artifacts from this area tended to just sort of be sort of decorative, sort of abstract designs. You didn't see a lot of representational products being created, so anytime you do find one, it really stands out. All right, Sandy? I'm not going to read all this, but because I'm watching the time, but a lot of people are not aware of the Potomac Rangers in Maryland and the Potomac Rangers' relationship with local Native Americans. It's very interesting. If you go down to McKee-Besher and you see that Hunting Porter Road, that is called Hunting Porter Road because of Captain Richard Brightwell. And anybody ever heard of a place called Brightwell Crossing? That's where the name came from. He was one of Maryland's Rangers. So please, this will be posted online. I encourage you to read about it if you're a history buff. It's quite interesting and hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the state. So I'm just going to zip past it because I'm watching the time. McKee-Beshers, yes, I'm in love with McKee-Beshers. That's why I keep bringing it up. There are a lot of sites here. One site is Sycamore Landing itself. If you go down River Road, you go down Sycamore Landing Road, that gravel road, it leads you to that dead-end parking lot by the canal and the river. I forgot to inform you that part of this site is under that road and under that parking lot. And it was a hamlet or a hunting camp. And then if you walk down the little stairs there, you peer out into the river, you see the island, Van Deventer Island there. Also had a village on it. Here's Sycamore Landing Road, and then there's the island. Sandy? Hughes site, this is the water view right down from the Hughes site. If you go to that Sycamore Landing parking lot, and you go to the edge of the parking lot, and you look west, you'll see a long field right there paralleling the river. That field, the one north, and the one above that one, was all part of the Hughes site. This was a Keyser complex site, and this is one of just 2 Keyser complex sites in the entire Potomac Piedmont. So it's very exceptional. This village at its height was home to about 100 to 200 people, which for us with our modern numbers may not sound that impressive. However, in 1860, Poolesville had just 200 people living in it. And at that time, Poolesville was the 2nd largest town in the county, only behind Rockville. So to give you a little bit of context, in the pre-contact era, that was a major habitation here at the Hughes site.
Is that from the census for people of color counted in that census?
No. They would have been counted separately, and you can find.
So they got maybe
Mhm.
Well, there's in the incorporated part of Poolesville, which I believe the incorporated part of Poolesville only had whites. And black families lived on the outside of the incorporated area of Poolesville.
Yes, but also there were white families that lived in Poolesville that did own enslaved people that did live
okay.
here. In fact, listen, here we go, Kevin, good job. Here where the parking garage is today, car garage. I told you I was tired. There was once a house there, and one of the families that owned Annington down by White's Ferry lived in that house. And they did have enslaved people that were living in town with them. So you're right, it is an inaccurate number for sure. And in fact, interestingly enough, one of the enslaved people that did live in this house was later interviewed, I think it was during the 1930s. You know what I'm talking about, when people went around interviewing former enslaved people and getting their histories. And I can't remember the man's name, but he had a really interesting story of sharing about his life growing up with Annington and fond memories of the missus. But then he talked about the overseer, and he said the overseer was so cruel that if he got a chance, he would kill him dead. But he ended up living over in Sugar Land. Yep. So this was a large, a lot of history here. So this was a large village of people, and there's a big mystery here too. There are a lot of burials there, and based on the physical evidence and condition of a lot of the people buried there, it's likely that they met their ends in violent ways. There are 4 decapitated remains, remains with head trauma, at an unusual rate for one village. This is also one of the villages in this area where you see dog burials. Dogs were used for hunting, they were used for guarding, they were used for companionship. And there has been some study of placement of dog burials in some of these societies. And often it's noted that dog burials were placed at the periphery of the villages, almost to suggest that perhaps they sort of had a watchdog feature or function even after their death. So it's not conclusive evidence, but it's definitely interesting to think about. Now, this site, I'm sad to say, was excavated, not very respectfully, by a man named Nicholas Ginger in the 30s. And then later on, there were some professional excavations that took place later. Sandy? And so, Nicholas Ginger, who conducted the initial excavations here, and this is that same field I was telling you about, where now the Sycamore Landing parking lot is. You can see a small cabin there in the distance. His brother, Roy Lee, was sort of a local eccentric. He was like a lifelong bachelor, and he lived in this little fishing cabin down here, and then I think further down towards Seneca at one time. And he had been collecting wild greens, and he noticed that there were some Native American artifacts in this area. And so he let his brother, Nicholas, know, hey, you might like to come down here and have a look. And you could talk to the farmer who owns this property and see if he'll let you, dig up some of these artifacts. And so he got the green light, and the two brothers and some helpers excavated 73 burials and many artifacts. And not everybody was very happy with Nicholas and how he conducted this for a lot of reasons. So he was very defensive about it later in life, and he said that he was careful and respectful. However, local residents, some of them recall him taking a backhoe to some of these burial grounds. He also conducted study digs on that Van Deventer Island right here, and the Winslow site downriver. He sold the relics that he found and the skeletons and other artifacts to buyers, to various institutions, including the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, and in his downtown Frederick shop. I will say that this interested me for a lot of reasons, and I went up to the Sieber Arts Library in downtown Frederick, where they have the Maryland Room, with Mary Mannix, who's an amazing librarian there, and they have his journals from these days. And so I went through them, and I can't tell you how upsetting it was to read this, because he's talking about, burial number 64 was an infant, and he talks about excavating these remains and how I'm not going to get into the gory details, but basically how a lot of the remains were so old and so delicate, they were like paper, and they just crumbled to dust. And you're sitting here reading this, and you're thinking, just let them rest. What are you doing? I'm sorry? Yeah. It's definitely a red flag, that's for sure. But he was motivated by curiosity. He fancied himself like a self-taught archaeologist. He thought he was doing this correctly. He took sketches and all that, but a lot of archaeologists at that time, they're like, whoa, 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 buddy, this is not it. Stop. But a lot of the damage had been done. All right, we can keep going. Just downriver from the Hughes site is Winslow's site, which half of it was destroyed when the Zuno Canal was constructed. The interesting thing about this site is this is the largest collection of chunky stones that have ever been found in the state of Maryland. 115 complete, broken, or incomplete examples were recovered. And here are chunky stones from Frederick and Montgomery